February 7th, 1985, 2 in the afternoon. Guadalajara, Mexico. DEA Special Agent Enrique Camarena stepped out of his office to meet his wife for lunch. The DEA had never lost an agent to a cartel kidnapping in its 12-year history. He had years of field experience, a network of informants, and full agency backing. He never made it to the restaurant. These are 10 horrifying cases of DEA agents caught by the cartel. Kiki Camarena, the DEA agent, tortured to death by the Guadalajara cartel. Enrique Camarena went by Kiki to everyone who knew him, and on the morning of February 7th, 1985, he was doing something almost embarrassingly normal. He was finishing up paperwork at the DEA office in Guadalajara, Mexico, getting ready to meet his wife for lunch. He had been a Drug Enforcement Administration special agent for 11 years, 4.5 of them in Guadalajara. He was 37 years old. He and his wife, Mika, had 3 young sons together, and the family had built a life in Mexico that felt, by every outward appearance, settled and good. The weather was warm, the kids went to an American school. Kiki had a reputation inside the DEA as the agent who could talk anyone into helping him, the one who built trust with informants faster than anybody else in the office. He had grown up in Mexicali, on the California-Mexico border, the son of a house painter, and he had told his mother years earlier, before he ever became an agent, that even one person could make a difference. That was the kind of man he was. He believed it. And on February 7th, none of that mattered to the 5 armed men who surrounded him outside his office, forced him into a car, and disappeared with him into the streets of Guadalajara in broad daylight. To understand why those men were waiting for him, you have to go back several months, to the fall of 1984. Camarena had spent years quietly building a network of informants across western Mexico, and that work paid off in November 1984 when he helped uncover a marijuana plantation called Rancho Buffalo. This wasn't a backyard operation. It covered roughly 2,500 acres and was estimated to generate around $8 billion a year for the men who ran it. Mexican and American authorities raided it, destroyed it, and in doing so, gutted a massive chunk of income belonging to a group that would later be known as the Guadalajara Cartel. The cartel's 3 biggest figures were Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. These were men who had built fortunes moving marijuana and heroin into the United States, and the Rancho Buffalo raid hit them right where it hurt. According to testimony given years later in federal court, cartel leaders gathered that same September at the home of an associate named Javier Barba Hernandez. They agreed, as a group, that someone needed to pay for the losses the DEA had been causing them. They decided the agent responsible needed to be picked up. They settled on a name. That name was Enrique Camarena. What happened next shows exactly how far the fear and fury inside that cartel had spread, and it happened to 2 men who had nothing to do with the DEA at all. On the night of January 30th, 1985, 8 days before Camarena was taken, an American named John Walker was at a restaurant in Guadalajara called La Langosta with his friend Alberto Radelat. Walker had been living in the city, working on a novel. Radelat was just visiting him. They walked into the restaurant around 7 in the evening and unknowingly stepped into a private party of 10 to 15 cartel members who had been drinking for hours at a table that had been cleared out specifically for them by Fonseca Carrillo himself. Someone in that group decided the 2 Americans were spies, possibly undercover DEA agents. Walker and Radelat were grabbed, beaten with fists and guns, and dragged into a storage room where the beating continued until one of them, desperate, said something that sounded like an admission that they were police. It wasn't true. They were just 2 friends who had picked the wrong restaurant on the wrong night. They were driven outside the city to a field and killed there. Their bodies weren't found until June of that year. The cartel had killed 2 innocent strangers purely because they were terrified that the DEA was closing in on them, and that terror hadn't gone away. It was about to fall on Camarena next. By early 1985, the pressure on the cartel was constant and growing, and Camarena had become its most visible symbol. He knew the work he did was dangerous. Every DEA agent posted in Mexico in those years understood that informants who talked to American agents sometimes turned up dead, and that the cartels had corrupt police officers on their payroll who could be used as muscle whenever needed. What made Camarena's situation different was the level of personal blame the cartel placed directly on him for the Rancho Buffalo raid. He wasn't just another federal employee doing a job. In the eyes of Caro Quintero and the others, he was the man who had cost them everything. That kind of personal grudge, paired with men who had unlimited cash and corrupt police willing to do whatever they were paid to do, created the exact conditions for what happened on February 7th. Camarena left his office that morning to meet Mika for lunch, the kind of small, ordinary plan that fills up most people's days without anyone giving it a second thought. He never made it. 5 armed men surrounded him on the street, forced him into a vehicle, and drove away. Around the same time, a Mexican pilot named Alfredo Zavala Avelar, who had flown surveillance missions with Camarena to help locate cartel marijuana fields from the air, was kidnapped near the Guadalajara airport. Both men vanished within hours of each other. What happened to Camarena over the next 2 days is some of the most brutal and well-documented torture in DEA history. He and Zavala were taken to a house controlled by the cartel and interrogated for roughly 30 hours straight. Investigators who later pieced together the timeline from witnesses and forensic evidence found that during that period, Camarena's skull, jaw, nose, cheekbones, and windpipe were all crushed. His ribs were broken. A hole was drilled into his head with a screwdriver. According to allegations that later went to trial, a doctor named Humberto Alvarez Machain was brought in during the interrogation and gave Camarena injections meant to keep him alive longer so the torture and questioning could continue. The goal of all of it was information. What did the DEA know? Who had been talking? How much had Camarena already reported back to Washington? There is an audio recording connected to the case, the only known record of those final hours, though the exact circumstances of his death and who delivered the final blow remain disputed, even decades later. What isn't disputed is that Camarena and Zavala were both killed sometime around February 9th, 2 days after they were taken. Their bodies were not found right away. They had been buried, then later moved. It would be almost a month before anyone found them. On March 5th, 1985, the bodies of Enrique Camarena and Alfredo Zavala were discovered in the Mexican state of Michoacán, roughly 60 miles from Guadalajara, in a rural area far from where they had originally been buried. Forensic evidence later showed both men had first been buried closer to the city, in an area called Primavera Park, before being dug up and moved. The discovery hit the DEA like nothing before it. Camarena was the first American agent in the agency's history to be kidnapped, tortured, and murdered by a cartel on foreign soil, and the response from Washington was immediate and enormous. The DEA launched what became known as Operation Leyenda, the largest homicide investigation the agency had ever undertaken. Agents poured into Mexico. Pressure came down on the Mexican government from the highest levels of the US administration to find and arrest the people responsible. It didn't take long to identify suspects. Investigators zeroed in on Caro Quintero, Fonseca Carrillo, and Felix Gallardo almost immediately, and under heavy American pressure, Mexican President Miguel de la Madrid moved quickly to arrest Caro Quintero and Fonseca Carrillo. Felix Gallardo had more political protection and managed to avoid arrest for 4 more years, until 1989. The investigation also blew open something much bigger than one murder. Agents discovered that a significant part of the Jalisco State Police Force had been on the cartel's payroll, and that it was actually corrupt police officers, not cartel gunmen, who had physically grabbed Camarena off the street at the cartel's request. Officials at the highest levels of Mexican law enforcement were implicated, including the past director of the Mexican Federal Judicial Police and the former head of Interpol's Mexico office. Evidence on Camarena's own body had reportedly been destroyed by Mexican police before American investigators could examine it properly. The case strained relations between the two countries for years, partly because the DEA, frustrated by how difficult it was to extradite Mexican citizens, eventually used bounty hunters to physically grab Dr. Alvarez Machain and bring him across the border to face trial in Los Angeles. That decision was controversial enough that it eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, which ruled the abduction hadn't violated the extradition treaty between the two countries. When Alvarez Machain's case finally went to trial in 1992, though, the judge found there wasn't enough evidence to convict him, and he was released. 10 separate trials connected to Camarena's murder were eventually held in Los Angeles. The biggest one centered on 4 men: Javier Vázquez Velasco, Juan Ramón Mata Ballesteros, Rubén Zuno Arce, and Juan José Bernabé Ramírez. Zuno Arce was not just any cartel associate. He was the brother-in-law of a former Mexican president, and his conviction sent a clear message that even powerful, well-connected people weren't untouchable in this case. On August 6, 1990, after a trial that lasted roughly 2 months, the jury returned its verdicts. Zuno Arce was convicted on kidnapping charges. Mata Ballesteros and Bernabé Ramírez were both convicted of kidnapping, but acquitted of murder. Vázquez Velasco was convicted on 2 separate counts, tied to his role in the murders of John Walker and Alberto Radelat, the 2 Americans beaten to death the week before Camarena was taken, since prosecutors successfully argued that both sets of killings were part of the same pattern of cartel retaliation against the DEA. On May 23, 1991, Vázquez Velasco was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life imprisonment. The courts ruled, in later appeals, that American law could reach crimes like these even though they happened entirely on Mexican soil, because the murders had been a direct attack on U.S. drug enforcement efforts and, by extension, U.S. national security. The 3 men believed to have ordered Camarena's killing went through Mexico's own legal system rather than America's. Caro Quintero, Fonseca Carrillo, and Felix Gallardo were all eventually convicted in Mexico for their roles in the kidnapping and murder. But the story of accountability didn't end there, and in some ways it's still being written today. Caro Quintero was sentenced to 40 years, but in 2013, after serving 28 of them, a Mexican appeals court overturned his sentence on a technicality and released him. He went straight back into drug trafficking, this time setting off violent turf wars in the northern state of Sonora. In 2018, the FBI added him to its 10 most wanted fugitives list, specifically for Camarena's murder. Mexican forces finally recaptured him in 2022, 14 years after his release, and after years of legal maneuvering, he was expelled to the United States in February 2025 and arraigned in federal court in Brooklyn, where he pleaded not guilty to charges including conspiracy to murder and running a continuing criminal enterprise. He's currently set to face trial in 2027, and if convicted, he could be sentenced to life in prison or face the death penalty. Fonseca Carrillo, now elderly, successfully petitioned a Mexican court in 2016 for house arrest due to his age and health, and he remains in Mexico to this day. Felix Gallardo is also still in Mexico, still serving out his sentence. For Camarena's family, none of this brought back the husband and father they lost. Mica Camarena raised their 3 sons, Enrique, Daniel, and Eric, without him. Camarena's sister Myrna, who had joined the DEA herself as a secretary the same year her brother became an agent, spent the rest of her own life watching the case slowly inch toward justice. When Caro Quintero was finally sent to the United States in 2025, she released a statement on behalf of the family. They had waited, she said, for 14,631 days, holding on to hope that this moment would come. In 2025, the family also filed a civil lawsuit against the Sinaloa cartel and 3 suspected drug kingpins tied to the killing, seeking damages for what was done to Kiki 40 years earlier. The DEA itself has called Camarena's death the single most significant event in the agency's history, a case that changed how the United States pursues cartels operating outside its borders and led directly to new laws giving prosecutors the power to charge foreign traffickers for crimes committed against American agents overseas. Every year, schools across the country still recognize Red Ribbon Week, a drug prevention campaign that began as a tribute to Camarena after his death, started by people in his hometown community who wanted his name to mean something more than just a headline. 40 years later, his case is still open in some sense, the final trial against the man accused of ordering his murder still waiting to happen in a Brooklyn courtroom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Camarena's case forced the entire DEA to rethink how it operated south of the border, the next agents on this list weren't undercover infiltrators working a years-long case. They were 2 men driving to a drug buy who never even made it to the meeting point, kidnapped in broad daylight by the very traffickers they thought they were about to negotiate with. Don Ware and Roy Stevenson, the DEA agents who played dead to survive a cartel execution. Don Ware had already lived a full career in law enforcement by the time he became a DEA agent. He started out as a police officer in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1967, and not long after, he joined the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, the federal agency that would later merge into what we now know as the Drug Enforcement Administration when it was officially created in 1973. By 1975, Ware was working out of the DEA's Las Vegas office, and he had built a reputation as a steady, experienced agent willing to chase down leads that took him far outside his own backyard. One of those leads came from a confidential informant who tipped him off about a heroin dealer operating across the border in Mexico. Ware didn't ignore it. He traveled to Arizona to link up with other DEA agents and with Mexican authorities, putting together a plan to make a buy from the source the informant had identified. One of the agents who joined him for that trip was a man named Wilfred Stevenson, who went by Roy and worked out of the DEA's office in San Luis, Arizona, right on the border. The 2 men were about to drive into the small Mexican border town of San Luis Rio Colorado, in the state of Sonora, to do what DEA agents did constantly in that era: meet face to face with the very criminals they were trying to lock up, in order to gather enough evidence to take them down. To understand how dangerous that kind of work actually was, it helps to know what the drug trade along the US-Mexico border looked like in the mid-1970s. Heroin trafficking out of Mexico had been growing for years, and small border towns like San Luis Rio Colorado had become key points for moving product north. The DEA itself was barely 2 years old as an agency, formed by merging several older federal drug units into one organization, and its agents in the field were still working out how to handle undercover buys in a country where they had no arrest powers and limited backup. Buy operations like the one Ware and Stevenson were running depended almost entirely on trust between the agent and the informant, and on the agent's own instincts once the meeting actually happened. There was no SWAT team waiting nearby. There was no easy way to call for help if something went wrong. An agent who walked into a buy meeting in rural Mexico in 1975 was, in a very real sense, walking in alone, relying on whatever weapon he could legally carry and whatever red he could get on the men he was about to do business with. On June 9, 1975, Ware and Stevenson set out to meet the heroin dealer their informant had identified, driving toward the location where the deal was supposed to happen. They never made it. Before they reached the meeting site, their vehicle was stopped by a group of men connected to the trafficking organization they were investigating. The men ordered both agents out of the car. They searched them for weapons. They found and seized the gun Stevenson was carrying. What they missed was the pistol tucked into Ware's waistband, hidden well enough that it slipped past the search entirely. That single missed detail would end up being the only thing standing between both agents and a quiet execution in the desert. Once the traffickers realized who they had, the situation turned violent fast. Ware was beaten badly, struck again and again by the men who had ambushed them. Both agents were then forced into the back of a pickup truck. Stevenson understood immediately what was happening. These men weren't planning to question them and let them go. They were driving them somewhere remote, somewhere with no witnesses, to kill them and leave their bodies where no one would find them easily. Stevenson made a decision in that truck bed that would save both their lives. He asked Ware, quietly, for his gun. Ware handed it over. When the pickup truck finally stopped, deep into the desert outside town, Stevenson moved. He jumped out of the truck bed and shot the driver in the head before the man had a chance to react. What followed was a chaotic, close-range gunfight between two wounded, outnumbered DEA agents and the remaining members of the kidnapping crew. Both Ware and Stevenson were shot twice during the exchange. Stevenson's wounds, while serious, were not life-threatening. Ware's were. He had taken bullets that tore through his body, causing severe internal damage, and he was bleeding badly in the dirt, with the gunfight still happening around him. In the middle of that chaos, both men made the only choice that gave them any real chance of walking away from this alive. They stopped moving. They stopped making sound. They let their bodies go limp in the dust and pretended they were already dead. It worked. The three men who had kidnapped them, believing both agents were finished, left them lying in the street and drove off into the desert night. Ware and Stevenson had survived an execution by doing nothing more than staying perfectly still while gravely wounded, surrounded by armed men who had every reason and every opportunity to make sure the job was finished. It is hard to overstate how close that moment came to ending in two more names added permanently to a list of agents who never came home. Help eventually reached them, and both men were transported for emergency medical treatment, though the road back to anything resembling normal life looked very different for each of them. For Roy Stevenson, the physical wounds, while serious, allowed for a more straightforward recovery. For Don Ware, the road ahead was brutal. The bullets that had torn through his body had caused damage severe enough that doctors weren't simply patching him up and sending him home. Ware remained in critical condition for months. He underwent extensive medical treatment and numerous operations, fighting to recover from injuries that easily could have killed him outright if the gunfight had gone even slightly differently. By some accounts, his hospitalization stretched across roughly 6 months as surgeons worked to repair what the M16 rounds had done to his body. He had qualified, under DEA policy, for a full medical retirement. Nobody would have questioned him for taking it. He had nearly died doing this job, in a foreign country, in a deal that had gone sideways the moment a search missed one hidden gun. Instead, Once he was well enough, Ware went back to work. He didn't return to fieldwork in the same way, but he stayed with the DEA, eventually working out of the agency's Las Vegas office for the rest of his career. He continued serving as an active DEA agent for 20 more years after the shooting, finally retiring in 1995, a full 25 years after he had first joined federal narcotics enforcement back in 1967. For his actions and his survival in 1975, Ware was awarded two of the DEA's most significant honors, the DEA Medal of Valor and the DEA Purple Heart Award. He married and built a family, with his wife Rita and three daughters, Jamie, Lori, and Anna Marie, all of them living with a father who carried, quite literally, the physical scars of that night in the Sonoran Desert for the rest of his life. His widow Rita would later describe publicly how the ordeal left permanent damage that followed the family for decades, long after the headlines about a DEA shooting in Mexico had faded. What happened to the men responsible for the ambush is, in some ways, its own slow, unfinished story. Unlike the Camarena case 10 years later, which set off a massive, internationally coordinated manhunt within days, the search for everyone involved in the attack on Ware and Stevenson stretched on far longer and with far less public attention. Decades after the shooting, law enforcement officials were still working to track down the final suspect connected to the ambush, a detail confirmed by current DEA personnel who have spoken about the case at retrospective panels years later. It is a reminder that not every act of cartel violence against American agents got the kind of swift, headline-grabbing justice that followed Camarena's murder. Some cases simply moved quietly through the system for years, with investigators chipping away at leads long after most people had forgotten the agents involved were ever ambushed in the first place. Don Ware's story did not end with his retirement in 1995. Nearly a decade later, on October 12, 2004, Ware died on the operating table during what was supposed to be a routine hip replacement surgery. The official cause was medical malpractice, specifically a perforation of a vein during the procedure. On the surface, that death looked completely unrelated to a gunfight that had happened almost 30 years earlier. But the people who knew Ware best understood there was a direct line connecting the two events. The damage from his 1975 gunshot wounds had compromised his body in ways that ultimately required the hip surgery that killed him. It took years of advocacy from people who refused to let that connection be ignored. The Nevada branch of the Association of Former Federal Narcotics Agents spent roughly 2 years working to convince the DEA that Ware's death, even though it technically happened on an operating table decades after the shooting, was a direct result of injuries he sustained while doing his job in Mexico. They succeeded. The DEA agreed that Ware's death qualified as a line-of-duty death, connecting a 2004 surgical complication all the way back to a 1975 ambush, in a way that finally gave his sacrifice the formal recognition it had always deserved. On May 12, 2011, Don Ware was memorialized on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial. The very next day, May 13, 2011, he was added to the DEA's own Wall of Honor, 36 years after he had been left for dead in the desert and pretended hard enough that he was believed. Don Ware passed away at 64 years old, having spent 37 years total in federal and local law enforcement, 25 of those years specifically with the DEA, after surviving an ambush that should have killed him on the spot. His story rarely makes it into the bigger conversations about cartel violence against American agents, mostly because it happened a decade before Camarena, in a much smaller town, with far less international attention. But the bare facts of what happened to him and Roy Stevenson on June 9, 1975, stand on their own. 2 agents were stripped of 1 weapon, missed a second, beaten, loaded into a truck meant to deliver them to their own execution, and survived only because one of them made a split-second decision to fight back, and both of them had the nerve to lie motionless in the dirt while gravely wounded and surrounded by the men who had just tried to kill them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Ware and Stevenson clawed their way out of a kidnapping nobody outside their own families ever heard much about, the next agent on this list wasn't lucky enough to walk away. He never even got the chance to fight back, gunned down at point-blank range after rolling down his car window to calmly explain who he really was. Jaime Zapata and Victor Avila ambushed on a Mexican highway by Los Zetas. Before this case gets going, one fact needs to be stated clearly and upfront. Jaime Zapata and Victor Avila were not DEA agents. They worked for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, specifically a division called Homeland Security Investigations, often shortened to ICE HSI. Their story gets mixed up with the DEA constantly online and in casual retellings, probably because their case is so often mentioned in the same breath as Kiki Camarena's, and because the agencies all work the same drug war on the same dangerous roads. But getting the agency right matters, especially when the whole point of telling these stories is sticking to what actually happened. So, this is a story about two federal agents from a different agency than DEA, ambushed by the same kind of cartel violence that has killed and injured American officers working in Mexico for decades. Jaime Jorge Zapata was born on May 7, 1978, in Brownsville, Texas, a border town sitting directly across the river from Matamoros, Mexico. He came from a family that seemed almost built for federal law enforcement. He was one of 5 brothers, and every single one of them ended up working in some part of the criminal justice field. Zapata went to Homer Hanna High School in Brownsville, then attended the University of Texas at Brownsville, where he earned a degree in criminal justice along with an associate degree in applied science, graduating in 2005. From there, he joined ICE, eventually landing in the Homeland Security Investigations Division, the branch of ICE that handles transnational crime, including drug trafficking and the violence tied to it. By February 2011, Zapata had been with the agency for a few years and had built a career working exactly the kind of cases that put him in close, regular contact with the dangers of Mexico's cartel violence. On February 15, 2011, Zapata and his fellow HSI special agent, Victor Avila, were driving from Laredo, Texas, to Mexico City on an assignment for the agency. They were in an armored Chevrolet Suburban, the kind of reinforced vehicle meant to protect federal agents traveling through dangerous parts of Mexico, and the vehicle carried official diplomatic plates, the kind that are supposed to signal to anyone paying attention that the people inside are protected under international law. As they drove through the northern state of San Luis Potosí on a 4-lane federal highway called Highway 57 that connects Mexico City to Monterrey, the two agents noticed 2 SUVs following close behind them. The vehicles were moving fast, and Avila later described their driving as aggressive, the kind of behavior that puts an experienced agent on alert immediately. One of the SUVs sped up, past the agent's Suburban, and then gunmen inside opened fire on the vehicle. The attackers eventually rammed the Suburban off the road entirely. What the agents didn't know in that moment, and what later trial evidence would reveal, is that they hadn't been specifically targeted as American federal agents. The men attacking them were part of 2 Los Zetas hit squads, groups the cartel itself referred to internally as estacas, and on that particular afternoon, their assignment had nothing to do with Zapata or Avila personally. They were on a mission to steal vehicles for the cartel's own operations, and the armored Suburban, with its diplomatic plates, simply looked like a good target to grab. It's a detail that makes the entire attack even harder to process, because it means 2 trained federal agents ended up in a gunfight for their lives, and one of them ended up dead, essentially because a cartel hit squad wanted their car. Once the Suburban was forced off the road, the situation turned violent almost immediately. When Zapata shifted the vehicle into park, the doors automatically unlocked, a basic safety feature in most vehicles that, in this moment, became a serious problem. One of the Zeta gunmen pulled open the driver's side door and tried to physically drag Zapata out of the vehicle. Zapata fought him off and managed to get the doors locked again, buying himself and Avila a small amount of time. The two agents then cracked their windows, hoping to talk their way out of what was unfolding around them. They identified themselves clearly as American diplomats, exactly the kind of declaration that, under different circumstances, might have made armed men think twice. As many as 15 gunmen had surrounded the vehicle by this point. According to the account Avila later gave, and according to testimony from Texas Congressman Michael McCall, the gunmen heard the agents identify themselves and didn't care. One of the attackers reportedly responded with a dismissive curse, something to the effect that they didn't give a damn who the agents claimed to be, and then the group opened fire. The gunfire that followed was overwhelming. Investigators later recovered roughly 90 shell casings from the scene, a number that gives some sense of just how much firepower was unleashed on two men sitting in a stopped vehicle. Victor Avila was shot twice in the leg. He survived, and he was eventually transported to a hospital in Houston, Texas, for treatment. Jaime Zapata was hit 3 times. Even with 3 bullet wounds, gravely injured, and almost certainly aware of how serious his condition was, Zapata managed to shift the Suburban into gear and drive the vehicle forward, away from the gunman, before he finally collapsed at the wheel. A Mexican federal police helicopter arrived at the scene not long after, but it was too late for Zapata. He died from his injuries before anyone could get him the kind of emergency treatment that might have saved him. The weapon that killed Zapata and wounded Avila turned out to have a paper trail that led straight back across the border into the United States, and that trail became one of the most controversial parts of the entire case. The rifle used was a semi-automatic Wasa-10, a type of weapon based on the AK-47 design. It had been purchased months earlier in Dallas, Texas, by a man named Otilio Osorio. The gun's serial number had been filed off before it was smuggled into Mexico, along with 9 other rifles. According to congressional investigators who later examined the case, federal agents at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, commonly known as the ATF, had already identified Osorio as a likely straw purchaser, meaning someone who buys guns legally on behalf of people who can't legally buy them themselves, months before he bought the gun that ended up killing Zapata. This connected the case to a much larger and far more politically explosive controversy involving a botched ATF operation known as Operation Fast and Furious, in which agents had knowingly allowed illegally purchased guns to cross into Mexico in hopes of tracing them to higher-level cartel figures, a strategy that backfired badly and resulted in American-bought weapons turning up at multiple violent crime scenes, including the killing of U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry just 2 months earlier. The ATF has publicly stated that the specific weapons trafficking case connected to Zapata's death had no direct connection to Fast and Furious itself, though the broader pattern of American guns flowing into cartel hands and then being used against American agents remained the same no matter which specific government program or investigative failure was responsible. Zapata's family later filed a lawsuit alleging that the weapons used in the attack had originated in Texas, demanding accountability for how American firearms kept ending up in the hands of the men killing American officers. The investigation into who was responsible moved with real speed and real coordination between the two countries, something that hadn't always been the case in earlier killings of American agents in Mexico. The death of an HSI agent traveling on official assignment on a major federal highway in broad daylight put enormous pressure on Mexican authorities to identify and capture everyone involved, and the FBI led an investigation with substantial help from ICE, the ATF, the DEA, and the State Department. 7 Mexican nationals were eventually identified, located, and extradited to the United States to face charges. 2 of them, Jose Emmanuel Garcia Sota, who went by the nickname Zafado, and Jesus Ivan Quesada Piña, who went by Loco, were the men prosecutors said had actually been part of the group that opened fire on the agent's vehicle. Their case went to a full jury trial in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. The trial began on July 10, 2017, and the government called 22 witnesses, including Victor Avila himself, who had survived the attack and was able to testify directly about what happened that day on Highway 57. On July 27, 2017, the jury found both men guilty on 4 separate federal charges: murder of a United States officer, attempted murder of a United States officer, attempted murder of an internationally protected person, and using and discharging a firearm during a violent crime that caused a death. Both men were sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison. 5 other men connected to the case took a different path through the legal system, pleading guilty rather than going to trial. Ruben Dario Venegas Rivera, known as Catracho, and the only Honduran national among the group, along with Jose Ismael Nava Villagran, known as Cacho, Julian Zapata Espinoza, known as Piolín, and Alfredo Gaston Mendoza Hernandez, known as Camarón, all pleaded guilty to federal murder and attempted murder charges at various points between August 2011 and October 2016. A 5th man, Francisco Carbajal Flores, known as Dalmata, pleaded guilty in January 2012 to a slightly different charge: conspiracy connected to running a criminal enterprise through racketeering, along with a charge of being an accessory after the fact to the murder and attempted murder of the 2 agents. Separately, a high-ranking Los Zetas leader named Jesus Enrique Rejon Aguilar, who went by the nicknames Mamito and Caballero, and who has been described as having authority over the very region of Mexico where Zapata was killed, was captured and extradited to the United States in September 2012. Rejon Aguilar pleaded guilty to a federal charge of conspiring to import multi-ton quantities of cocaine and marijuana into the United States, a drug trafficking charge rather than a charge tied directly to Zapata's murder, though his capture came as part of the broader manhunt connected to the investigation into the attack. The legal story didn't end cleanly there either. In January 2023, a federal appeals court in Washington, D.C., reviewed the convictions of Garcia Sota and Quesada Piña and vacated 2 of their original counts, sending their cases back down to a lower court for what's called resentencing, a narrower legal process focused specifically on how the murder and attempted murder charges should be calculated rather than a full retrial of guilt or innocence. As of the most recent reporting on the case, both men remained in federal custody, serving life sentences, while that resentencing process worked its way through the courts, more than a decade after the actual shooting on Highway 57. The killing of Jaime Zapata reshaped policy conversations in both countries almost immediately. Mexican President Felipe Calderón called for closer cooperation between the 2 nations, saying Zapata's death needed to push both countries toward a more secure future. Other Mexican officials promised to use every judicial and investigative tool available to find everyone responsible. In the United States, Zapata's killing reopened a long-running debate about whether American federal agents working in Mexico should be permitted to carry firearms for their own protection, since agents in Zapata's position had often operated under restrictions that limited what kind of self-defense capability they had while on assignment south of the border. 5 months after Zapata's death, a White House report acknowledged that his family was demanding answers about exactly where the weapons used against him had come from, a demand that eventually connected directly back to the gun trafficking failures tied to Fast and Furious and similar ATF operations. Back home in Brownsville, the city where Zapata grew up and went to school, an avenue was renamed in his honor, a small but permanent marker meant to make sure his name kept meaning something to the community that raised him, long after the news coverage of his death had faded from the front page. What happened to Zapata and Avila on that highway in San Luis Potosí stands as one of the clearest examples of just how indiscriminate cartel violence in Mexico can be. These two men weren't undercover operatives who had spent years infiltrating a criminal organization, the way Camarena had. They weren't targeted in a calculated act of revenge for some specific operation that had cost a cartel money. They were simply driving through cartel territory in a nice, armored vehicle that a group of cartel gunmen wanted to steal, and when that vehicle turned out to be carrying 2 American federal agents instead of an easy target, the gunmen chose to open fire anyway, rather than let them go. Diplomatic plates didn't stop it. Identifying themselves clearly as American officials didn't stop it. The only thing that mattered to the men surrounding that Suburban in that moment was finishing what they had started, and Jaime Zapata paid for that decision with his life at the age of 32. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Zapata and Avila never had a chance to do anything but fight for their lives in the span of a few violent minutes on a highway, the next agent on this list faced a completely different kind of danger, one that took years instead of seconds to play out, and that came disguised as friendship, money, and the comfortable life of a man who thought he was running his own operation, right up until the moment federal investigators proved he had actually become exactly what he was supposed to be hunting. Jose Irizarry, the DEA agent who became the cartel's man. This case looks a little different from the others on this list, and that difference matters enough to explain up front. Jose Irizarry was never kidnapped. Nobody tortured him, ambushed him, or held a gun to his head. What happened to him took years instead of minutes, and it ended with federal prosecutors calling him the most corrupt agent in the history of the Drug Enforcement Administration. This is a story about a different kind of cartel capture, the slow kind, where a man sworn to take down a cartel ends up living like one of its own bosses instead. Jose Irizarry was born and raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Before he ever wore a DEA badge, he worked as a federal air marshal, the kind of job that puts a person in close contact with security screening and background checks. In 2009, the DEA hired him as a special agent, even though he had failed a polygraph exam during the hiring process, a detail that would look very different in hindsight than it must have looked at the time. Irizarry was bilingual, sharp, and ambitious, and he landed an assignment that made him valuable almost immediately, handling undercover money laundering investigations, the kind of work where DEA agents pose as launderers themselves, moving cartel cash through fake businesses and bank accounts in order to trace where drug money actually goes and who controls it. He was first stationed with the DEA's Miami Field Division, a posting that put him at the center of some of the agency's biggest financial investigations into Colombian and Mexican trafficking networks. In Miami, Irizarry built a reputation as a rising star, someone overseeing undercover work that led to dozens of arrests. His bosses saw him as exactly the kind of agent the DEA wanted more of. In 2011, while still working out of Miami, Irizarry met a man named Marin, a Colombian who had built a career as a money launderer for what remained of the old Cali cartel, the once dominant Colombian trafficking organization run for years by brothers Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela. Marin had already drawn attention from Colombia's own police, who had publicly identified him as a major smuggler not long before he and Irizarry crossed paths. For a while, Marin was even briefly signed up as a DEA informant, the kind of complicated, blurry arrangement that happens constantly in undercover drug work, where the line between informant and target gets murky on purpose, because that's often the only way agents can get close enough to gather real intelligence. But according to a later Associated Press investigation, Marin wasn't just providing information. He was actively working to corrupt the agents around him, using prostitutes, expensive dinners, and expensive gifts to build relationships that gave him cover and protection. Irizarry became one of the people Marin corrupted most successfully, and the relationship between them grew far beyond anything resembling a normal source and handler arrangement. At some point, Marin became the godfather of Irizarry's twin daughters, a detail that says more about how close this relationship became than almost anything else in the entire case. Around the same time this relationship was deepening, Irizarry's personal financial life was falling apart. In 2010, he filed for personal bankruptcy protection. It's a detail that matters because prosecutors later pointed to this exact period as the starting point of his criminal scheme. A federal agent under serious financial pressure, who had already failed a polygraph during hiring, who was now spending time with a wealthy and generous cartel-connected money launderer, was sitting in exactly the kind of position that makes corruption easy to slide into, rather than something that requires a dramatic, single decision. Irizarry didn't wake up one day and decide to betray the DEA. He drifted into it, one favor and one gift at a time, until the favors and gifts became something much bigger. What Irizarry actually did with his position inside DEA money laundering operations turned out to be staggering in scale. As a special agent running undercover sting accounts, he had access to systems meant to move and track drug proceeds as part of legitimate investigations. Accounts where cartel cash was supposed to flow through controlled channels so agents could trace where it went and build cases against the people on the other end. Instead, Irizarry began diverting that money for himself and a group of Colombian co-conspirators. According to his own guilty plea and the federal indictment against him, he and his associates ultimately diverted approximately $9 million from undercover DEA money laundering investigations. To make this work, without getting caught immediately, Irizarry and his co-conspirators used a stolen identity to open a fraudulent bank account, then ran diverted drug proceeds through that account. He filed false official reports about where sting money was going. He ordered DEA staff under him to wire money that was supposed to be used for undercover operations into international accounts that he and his associates controlled directly. The scheme ran across his entire time with the agency's money laundering unit, first in Miami and then later in an even more exposed posting overseas. In 2015, Irizarry was rewarded with a transfer to the DEA's office in Cartagena, Colombia, a city known as much for its beautiful Caribbean coastline and resort culture as for its proximity to ongoing cartel activity. For a corrupt agent already deep into a scheme built on diverted cartel cash, Cartagena turned out to be the perfect place to keep going. He bought a $767,000 home there, with sweeping ocean views and a rooftop pool that reportedly became something of an unofficial gathering spot for visiting agents and prosecutors passing through the region. He bought his wife a $30,000 diamond ring from Tiffany. He drove luxury sports cars, and traveled first class to Europe carrying Louis Vuitton luggage, wearing an expensive gold watch. None of this looked like the life of a federal agent living on a government salary, and according to later reporting, plenty of people around him noticed. Stories about Irizarry's yacht parties and extravagant spending had become well known among other agents and prosecutors he worked with long before he was ever arrested. Part of what made Irizarry's corruption so brazen, and part of what makes this case stand out, even among other instances of agency misconduct, is the lifestyle he and a group of colleagues built around their access to cartel money laundering investigations, something Irizarry himself later referred to as Team America. The way Irizarry described it in later interviews, agents involved in undercover money laundering work had effectively turned legitimate sting operations into an excuse to travel internationally and party at the cartel's expense. They picked cities for supposed money laundering pickups based on where major sporting events were happening, timing trips to coincide with Real Madrid soccer matches or Rafael Nadal tennis tournaments. Trips reportedly included stops in VIP rooms of strip clubs across the Caribbean, visits to Amsterdam's red light district, and at least one trip aboard a yacht in Colombian waters that launched with alcohol and more than a dozen prostitutes on board. In one specific incident, Irizarry later described in a memo asking the court for a reduced sentence, he recalled being in a VIP room at a Dominican Republic strip club called Dollhouse in 2014 with another, newer DEA agent, racking up a $2,300 bill that was ultimately paid by a violent enforcer working for Marine, a man with the nickname Iguana. That younger agent, identified in reporting as Nicholas Garofalo, later told the AP that he had been new to the job and eager to work money laundering cases, and that he believed at the time these trips were legitimate official business paid for through proper DEA channels. Garofalo has said Irizarry effectively used his presence to make the entire pattern of behavior look more normal and accepted than it actually was. This wasn't happening in a complete vacuum either. Around 2015, a separate DEA Inspector General report became public, criticizing agents for participating in what the report described as sex parties involving prostitutes hired by Colombian cartels, a scandal that existed alongside, but distinct from, the specific Irizarry case. One of the specific operations Irizarry was deeply involved in was known internally as whitewash. On paper, it looked like a major success story for the DEA. The agents running it claimed the operation had generated 125 arrests, the seizure of $107 million in assets, and the confiscation of nearly 9 tons of cocaine. But when the DEA conducted an internal audit of the operation in 2020, a 216-page review found that Whitewash's reported statistics had been wildly inflated. A separate internal memo prepared for the agency's then administrator went even further, describing the entire operation as what the memo called a mirage, language that suggests the program had been presented to DEA leadership as something far more substantial and effective than what it actually was on the ground. Some of the inflated numbers became almost absurd under closer examination. For instance, roughly $30 million of the operation's total claimed seized assets came from 2 stolen Van Gogh paintings that Italian investigators had separately recovered from the villa of a different, unrelated drug trafficker entirely. A recovery that had essentially nothing to do with Whitewash's actual undercover work, but got folded into the operation's success statistics anyway. By 2018, the gap between Irizarry's lifestyle and his government salary, combined with the growing rumors among colleagues, had become too obvious to ignore. He resigned from the DEA that year, stepping away from the agency before the full scope of what he had done had been formally laid out in any indictment. That gap between resignation and prosecution gave investigators time to build a case, and in February 2020, Irizarry was arrested and charged. The charges against him were extensive: conspiracy to launder money, honest services wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, conspiracy to commit identity theft, and aggravated identity theft. On December 14, 2020, Irizarry pleaded guilty to all 19 counts contained in his federal indictment, admitting to the full scope of conspiracy to commit money laundering, honest services wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. His attorney, Maria Dominguez, told the court that her client accepted full responsibility for his actions, though she also argued his personal take from the entire conspiracy never exceeded $600,000, a figure noticeably lower than the roughly $1 million in direct bribes and kickbacks prosecutors said he and his family had received, on top of the $9 million in diverted funds attributed to the broader conspiracy. Irizarry's sentencing took place in Tampa, Florida, in December 2021, in front of U.S. District Judge Charlene E. Honeywell. At the hearing, Irizarry broke down in tears, telling the court that the hardest part of his punishment wasn't the prison time itself, but having to explain to his two young daughters why their father would be gone for so long. His attorney made an argument during sentencing that drew real attention. She told the court that when Irizarry joined the DEA, he was, in her words, schooled in how to be corrupt and schooled in how to break the law, describing an internal culture where accepting money and gifts from criminal informants had become normalized rather than treated as the obvious violation it was. Judge Honeywell didn't simply dismiss that argument. She expressed open disgust with the DEA for what she described as its failures in this case, and she stated directly that other agents corrupted by what she called the allure of easy money also needed to be investigated, telling the courtroom that this kind of behavior had to stop and that Irizarry was simply the one who got caught, not the only one involved. She sentenced him to just over 12 years in federal prison and ordered him taken into custody immediately. He began serving that sentence in early January 2022, after giving a series of lengthy, emotional interviews to the Associated Press in his native San Juan in the days before reporting to a federal detention center. What happened after Irizarry's sentencing turned this from a single corrupt agent's downfall into something that has continued to ripple through the DEA for years. Once he had pleaded guilty, Irizarry began cooperating extensively with federal investigators, spending what his attorney described as endless hours providing information about other agents and prosecutors he claimed had participated in or turned a blind eye to the same culture of corruption that had consumed him. He alleged that as many as 24 current and former DEA agents and prosecutors had either joined in similar behavior or knowingly allowed it to continue without reporting it. Some of his former colleagues have pushed back hard against these claims, calling them exaggerated or outright fabricated, suggesting Irizarry built up a narrative implicating others specifically to help reduce his own sentence. Attorneys representing some of the people Irizarry named in his accounts have accused federal investigators of going on what one called a fishing expedition, looking to charge additional people simply to justify years of investigation, rather than because solid evidence of additional crimes actually exists. As of the most recent public reporting, beyond Irizarry himself, only his wife, Nathalia Gomez Irizarry, and a Colombian customs worker have faced charges connected to the broader conspiracy, though the Justice Department's internal investigation into other agents and prosecutors named by Irizarry has reportedly continued well beyond his own conviction. A separate Justice Department Inspector General report criticized the DEA more broadly for failing to properly oversee the kind of tightly controlled undercover sting operations Irizarry had been trusted to run, a rebuke serious enough that the DEA's then administrator, Ann Milgram, ordered an outside review of the agency's entire approach to foreign operations. The DEA's own public response to the case has been measured but pointed. In a statement following Irizarry's sentencing, Milgram said her former special agent had abused the trust of the American people by repeatedly violating his oath as a federal law enforcement officer, while also stating that bringing him to justice reflected the values held by the rest of the agency's workforce. Homeland Security investigations, which had assisted in the broader case alongside the FBI, IRS criminal investigation, and the Justice Department's own Office of Inspector General, issued a similar statement describing Irizarry's conduct as an egregious breach of the trust placed in him as a federal agent, while emphasizing that his actions were not representative of the vast majority of government employees who do their jobs honestly. The DEA itself has largely declined to comment further on Irizarry's broader allegations against other agents, leaving those claims to play out through whatever ongoing investigations and potential future charges may eventually follow. What makes Irizarry's story land so differently from the other cases on this list is exactly the absence of violence at its center. There was no kidnapping, no torture, no gunfight, no funeral. Instead, there was a slow, almost mundane drift from financial trouble into bribery, from bribery into outright theft, and from outright theft into a lifestyle so visibly extravagant that colleagues were gossiping about his yacht parties years before any federal charge ever touched him. The cartel didn't need to capture Jose Irizarry by force. It simply needed to be patient, generous, and willing to make a struggling federal agent's life easier, one expensive gift and one international trip at a time, until the agent meant to be hunting cartel money had quietly become one of the people moving it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Irizarry's downfall took years to build and ended with him walking calmly into a federal courtroom to plead guilty, the next agent on this list had no warning at all, caught in the middle of traffic when a car deliberately cut him off, in a moment that could have ended his life in seconds rather than in a courtroom a decade later. He talked his way out of it using nothing but his badge and his nerve, in a country where Pablo Escobar's men were actively hunting down anyone connected to the agency trying to bring him in. Steve Murphy, the DEA agent with a price on his head in Pablo Escobar's Colombia. Nobody died in this story, and nobody got dragged off into captivity. What happened to Steve Murphy is a near miss, a moment that could have ended in tragedy but didn't, and it comes straight from Murphy's own published account of his years hunting Pablo Escobar. It's worth telling anyway, because it shows exactly what it felt like, day to day, to be an American agent, living inside a country where the most powerful drug trafficker on earth had a price tag on your head. Stephen E. Murphy, born in 1957, started his career in law enforcement young, working as a teenage intern with the police department in Bluefield, West Virginia, before joining the force there as a uniformed officer at 19. He spent years building a career as a small-town cop, before eventually moving on to bigger assignments. And in 1987, he became a special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration. His early DEA work took him to Miami, Florida, right in the middle of the cocaine boom of the 1980s, where he worked undercover sting operations against traffickers. He once described how quickly the scale of his work escalated, recalling a case where he went from seeing 2 ounces of cocaine as the biggest bust of his career to suddenly being involved in an undercover sting that brought in 400 kilos, or roughly 880 pounds, smuggled aboard a fishing boat rigged with hidden cameras and microphones. He called it addictive, in the sense that the adrenaline of the job pulled him in deeper and deeper. By the time the DEA needed agents willing to take on one of the most dangerous overseas assignments in the agency's history, Murphy had already proven he could handle pressure. In 1991, Murphy and his wife, Connie, made the decision together to accept a transfer to Colombia, the home base of Pablo Escobar, the leader of the Medellin cartel and, at the time, one of the most wanted criminals on the planet. Escobar had built an empire smuggling cocaine into the United States, and he had used an extraordinary amount of violence to protect that empire, ordering the assassination of Colombia's own Attorney General and orchestrating the bombing of a commercial passenger jet in 1989 in an attempt to kill a single political target who happened to be on board. Murphy was assigned to work alongside another DEA special agent, Javier F. Peña, who had joined the agency in 1984 and had already been stationed in Bogotá since 1988. Together, Murphy and Peña became the lead American investigators assigned to track Escobar down, working as part of a larger joint task force between the United States and Colombia, known as the Search Block. Because of how dangerous the assignment was considered, DEA agents posted to Colombia during this period, including Murphy and Peña, were paid 50% more than agents working similar jobs back in the United States, a clear acknowledgement from the agency itself of exactly how much risk these men were taking on. The danger wasn't abstract or theoretical. Sicarios, the young hired gunmen recruited heavily from Medellin's poorest neighborhoods, were paid by Escobar's organization to kill police officers, rivals, and anyone else who got in the cartel's way. According to accounts later given by Murphy and Peña themselves, the going rate the cartel paid for killing an ordinary Colombian police officer was shockingly low, sometimes cited at around $100 per killing, since the cartel viewed local cops as expendable and easy to replace. American DEA agents were a different story entirely. Murphy and Peña have both said that contracts placed on their lives by Escobar's organization were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, a price that reflected both the political weight of killing an American federal agent and the kind of overwhelming response such a killing would guarantee from Washington. Murphy has specifically pointed to one likely reason Escobar never followed through on those contracts the way he might have otherwise: the memory of what happened after Mexican traffickers tortured and killed DEA Special Agent Enrique Camarena in 1985. The American government's response to Camarena's death had been so massive, so relentless, and so internationally disruptive to drug trafficking operations across an entire country that even a man as ruthless as Escobar appeared to calculate that actually killing an American DEA agent wasn't worth the consequences it would bring down on his own organization. The contracts stayed on the books, the agents stayed alive, but that didn't mean the threat ever felt distant, and it certainly didn't stop moments of real, immediate fear from happening on ordinary days in Bogotá. Connie Murphy made the choice to join her husband in Colombia rather than staying behind in the relative safety of the United States, and she remained in the country with him for the full length of his assignment, rather than retreating home during the most dangerous stretches of the manhunt. A detail Murphy has pointed out differs from how the relationship was portrayed in later television dramatizations of their story. While Steve spent much of his time working out of Medellin, embedded at a military academy, alongside Colombian forces hunting Escobar directly, he and Connie kept an apartment together in Bogotá, and it was during one of Murphy's stretches back home in the capital that the incident at the center of this case took place. Murphy described coming home from the US Embassy with Connie one evening, both of them tired after a long day, planning to take some of the back roads near a military base, specifically to avoid the city's usual traffic, with a stop planned at a favorite restaurant to pick up takeout roast chicken and potatoes for dinner. It was meant to be a quiet, ordinary night, one of the few evenings they got to spend together uninterrupted, since Murphy's work frequently kept him away in Medellin for stretches at a time. He was driving one of the embassy's armored vehicles, an older model SUV reinforced for exactly this kind of environment. The vehicle had steel plates built into the doors, the floor, and the roof. The windows were made of extremely thick, bulletproof glass, thick enough that they couldn't even be rolled down. The front and rear of the vehicle were fitted with heavy chrome-plated steel bars, the kind sometimes called cattle guards, and the entire vehicle weighed roughly twice what a normal car would weigh because of all the added armor. Murphy had joked to Connie before that the vehicle felt sturdy enough to survive almost anything, even, as he put it, the apocalypse. That sense of security was about to be tested in a completely different way than he expected. A blue Renault suddenly cut directly in front of Murphy's SUV, forcing him to slam on the brakes and push in the clutch to keep from plowing into the much smaller car. Given how much the armored SUV weighed compared to an ordinary vehicle, Murphy understood immediately that a collision at that speed could seriously injure or even kill whoever was inside the smaller car. He managed to bring the SUV to a stop just inches away from the Renault. His first reaction, once he confirmed Connie was okay, was simple anger, the kind of frustration any driver feels after almost getting into a serious accident because of someone else's reckless driving. He started to get out of the vehicle, ready to confront whoever had just cut him off. That instinct disappeared the moment he actually looked up and saw what was happening outside his window. 3 men climbed out of the Renault and began walking toward Murphy's vehicle. They were dressed casually, in light jackets and jeans, nothing that would normally draw attention on a Bogota street. But as they got closer, Murphy could see that each of them had a pistol tucked into the waistband of his pants. In a country where Escobar's organization had standing contracts out on Murphy's life, and where DEA agents working the Escobar case lived with the constant possibility that any random encounter could turn out to be an assassination attempt in disguise, 3 armed men approaching his vehicle on foot, right after forcing him to nearly crash, was about as alarming a situation as Murphy could have walked into. He had spent years by this point absorbing the lesson of what had happened to Kiki Camarena less than a decade earlier. A fellow DEA agent kidnapped, tortured, and killed by traffickers in Mexico. Every agent working in Latin America after Camarena's murder carried some version of that fear with them, a constant awareness that the people walking toward your car with weapons visible might not be random criminals at all. Murphy didn't wait to find out the hard way. He got Connie's attention, made sure she understood the seriousness of what was unfolding, and worked to get local police involved as quickly as possible. He told the responding officers exactly what he had seen, that the men in the blue Renault had cut him off and were now approaching his vehicle armed with handguns, and that given his work investigating Escobar's organization, he genuinely believed these men could be sicarios sent to kill him. At the mention of guns, the police moved fast, surrounding the 3 men from the Renault and pointing their own weapons at them. It took a few tense moments for the full picture to come into focus, but once the responding officers realized exactly who Murphy was, and once they understood that he had direct contacts at the highest levels of the Colombian National Police through his work on the Escobar task force, their entire demeanor shifted. They began apologizing to both Murphy and Connie for the confusion and the fright they had just experienced. The 3 men in the Renault turned out to have nothing to do with Pablo Escobar at all. They were low-ranking members of the Colombian military, out on what amounted to a reckless joyride, driving carelessly and carrying sidearms simply because they were soldiers who happened to have access to weapons, not because they had been sent to hunt down an American federal agent. There was no cartel plot behind the near collision. There was no assassination attempt in progress. It had been, in the end, nothing more than a frightening coincidence involving careless young men with guns in a country where carrying a weapon barely raised an eyebrow. Once the situation had been fully sorted out and the police had moved on, Murphy and Connie drove the rest of the way home, both of them shaken by how quickly an ordinary errand for takeout chicken had turned into a moment where Murphy genuinely believed his life might be in danger. They sat together in their living room that night, eating their now slightly cold roast chicken and potatoes, straight out of styrofoam containers, with Connie pouring them both a glass of wine to help settle their nerves after everything that had just happened. Murphy has since described sitting there afterward, thinking about what the next close call might look like, and coming to an unsettling conclusion. The armored vehicle he had been driving, with all its steel plating and bulletproof glass, had been built specifically to survive exactly the kind of attack he feared was happening in that moment on the road. But Murphy understood, sitting in his own living room with his wife, that no amount of armor plating was actually going to protect him if Pablo Escobar himself ever decided the political cost of killing an American DEA agent was finally worth paying. That moment never came, not for Murphy and not for Peña. The two of them continued their work hunting Escobar for the rest of the search block operation, eventually setting up alongside Colombian Special Forces at the Carlos Holguin Military Academy near Medellin during the most intense stretch of the manhunt between July 1992, after Escobar escaped from the luxury prison he had essentially built for himself called La Catedral, and December 1993, when Colombian National Police finally tracked Escobar down and killed him during a rooftop chase through a Medellin neighborhood. Neither Murphy nor Peña was physically present on the roof when Escobar was shot, despite how the Netflix series Narcos later dramatized the moment, putting Murphy at the scene for visual effect. Murphy has said directly in later interviews that he was actually back at the police base when the final shooting happened, and that the show took creative liberties with several details from his and Peña's actual experience for the sake of better television. After Escobar's death, Murphy and Connie returned to the United States, bringing with them two daughters the couple had adopted while living in Colombia. Murphy continued his DEA career for roughly 2 more decades after leaving Bogotá, working assignments in Greensboro, North Carolina, and twice in Atlanta, Georgia, where he eventually led a mobile enforcement team program and helped build the city's organized crime drug enforcement task force. He continued climbing through DEA leadership, eventually being promoted into the agency's senior executive ranks in 2009 as a deputy assistant administrator overseeing the DEA's Office of Special Intelligence in Washington, D.C. Javier Peña stayed with the agency even longer, retiring in January 2014 after 30 total years of service as a special agent in charge. Years later, both men became consultants on Narcos, with actor Boyd Holbrook playing Murphy and Pedro Pascal playing Peña, and in 2019, they co-wrote a memoir together called Manhunters: How We Took Down Pablo Escobar, which is where this entire account of the Blue Renault and the 3 armed men comes directly from, told in Murphy's own words. What makes Murphy's story worth including here isn't a body count or a courtroom verdict. It's the simple fact that he lived for years inside a country where a 6-figure bounty hung over his head, where an armored vehicle felt like it might be his only real protection, and where one reckless near accident on a quiet back road was enough to make him believe, for several long minutes, that the contract on his life had finally come due. It didn't. He survived, retired with decades of additional service to the DEA, and got to write the ending to his own story himself, something not every agent on this list was lucky enough to do. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Murphy walked away from his close call with nothing more than a shaken night and a cold dinner, the next agent on this list wasn't quite as fortunate. Stabbed to death on a quiet street in Bogotá after stepping out of a cab, in a case that still raises an uncomfortable question about how much of Colombia's everyday street violence is really separate from its cartels at all. James Terry Watson, the DEA agent killed in a Bogotá robbery, gone wrong. This case needs one honest clarification before it starts. Colombian authorities and U.S. federal prosecutors both classified what happened to Terry Watson as a robbery, not a cartel-ordered hit. The men who killed him weren't sicarios sent by a drug trafficking organization to silence an investigator. They were a street crew running a well-known Bogotá scam, and by every piece of evidence gathered in the case, they had no idea the man they grabbed was a DEA agent until after he was already dead. Some people close to Watson questioned that conclusion at the time, wondering whether his work investigating major traffickers in Colombia made him a deliberate target rather than a random one. But nothing in the actual investigation, the guilty pleas, or the court record ever supported that theory. What follows is the true story of how a 13-year DEA veteran who had survived Taliban gunfire in Afghanistan died on a Bogotá street because a taxi driver decided he looked wealthy enough to rob. James Terry Watson was born on December 9, 1970, in Monroe, Louisiana, and grew up nearby in a small community called Holly Ridge in Richland Parish. He graduated from Northeast Louisiana University with a degree in criminal justice and built a career in law enforcement from the ground up. Before joining the DEA, Watson served in the United States Army and then spent 2 years, from 1998 to 2000, working for the U.S. Marshals Service. In 2000, he joined the DEA and began his career with the agency stationed in Honolulu, Hawaii, later transferring to a tour in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Watson built a reputation inside the agency as someone who consistently volunteered for the hardest, most dangerous assignments available, the kind of work most agents tried to avoid rather than seek out. That reputation showed clearly in his service record. Watson completed 3 separate deployments to Afghanistan as part of the DEA's Foreign Deployed Advisory and Support Team, known inside the agency as FAST, a program that sent specially trained DEA agents into active combat zones to work directly alongside U.S. military special forces on counter-narcotics missions. During one deployment in 2009, Watson and the Army Special Forces soldiers he was working with came under fire from an estimated 500 Taliban fighters in Afghanistan's Farah province, a firefight serious enough to stand out even among the dangerous missions DEA's FAST teams regularly took on. On other missions, Watson rappelled down rock faces roughly 3,000 feet high in mountainous terrain near the Pakistan border, specifically to reach and destroy hidden heroin production sites. Beyond Afghanistan, he volunteered for difficult assignments in Honduras, Guatemala, Haiti, and Panama, building a career defined by repeatedly choosing the hardest job available rather than the safest one. By 2013, Watson was assigned to the DEA's Cartagena, Colombia, resident office, working as part of a maritime drug smuggling investigation focused on tracking how traffickers moved cocaine by sea. On the evening of June 20, 2013, Watson was in Bogotá rather than Cartagena, there on official travel connected to his ongoing investigation. He spent that evening relaxing with colleagues from the U.S. Embassy at a restaurant, watching Game 7 of the NBA Finals between the Miami Heat and the San Antonio Spurs, an ordinary, low-key night out after a stretch of demanding work. Watson had recently gotten married to a woman named Fadia Margarita de la Rosa, whom he had met during his time serving in Colombia, and by all accounts from people who knew him, he had a deep appreciation for simple pleasures and a strong enthusiasm for life outside of work, despite the dangerous nature of his career. After leaving the restaurant that night, headed back toward his hotel, Watson hailed a taxi alone on the street, a completely ordinary decision that millions of people make every day in cities around the world without a second thought. The taxi that picked him up wasn't a random, honest cab. It belonged to a man named Julio Estevan Gracia Ramirez, who was part of a coordinated robbery crew running a scheme well known in Bogotá at the time, called a Paseo Millonario, which translates roughly to a millionaire's ride. The scheme worked by having a corrupt taxi driver pick up a passenger who looked like they might have money, then signal to a group of accomplices, following close behind in additional vehicles. Once the timing was right, those accomplices would get into the taxi with the unsuspecting passenger already inside, and the group would kidnap and rob the victim, sometimes driving them around the city for hours while forcing them to withdraw cash from ATMs, sometimes simply robbing them on the spot. On this particular night, the full crew involved 6 people. Gracia Ramirez drove the taxi that picked up Watson. A second taxi, driven by a man named Hector Leonardo Lopez, carried several of the other conspirators following behind, including Omar Fabian Valdez Gualtero, who had helped organize the crew and had obtained disposable cell phones for the group to use during the operation, and Edgar Javier Bello Murillo. A third taxi was also part of the original plan, carrying a man named Andres Alvaro Oviedo Garcia, but that vehicle developed mechanical problems before the crew reached Watson, and Oviedo Garcia ended up staying behind with the disabled cab rather than participating directly in what happened next. When Gracia Ramirez's taxi, carrying Watson, stopped at a red light, he gave a signal to the trailing vehicle. 2 of the men from that second taxi, Edwin Gerardo Figueroa Sepulveda and Edgar Javier Bello Murillo, got out and climbed into the back of Watson's cab alongside him. What followed happened fast and violently. Figueroa Sepulveda used a stun gun to shock Watson repeatedly, while Bello Murillo stabbed him multiple times with a knife. Watson fought back against the attack, but he was outnumbered inside a moving vehicle by men who had planned exactly this kind of ambush. Despite his injuries, Watson managed to get out of the taxi and ran roughly a block away from the scene before he finally collapsed from the wounds he had sustained. Bystanders nearby saw what had happened and came to help him, but Watson's injuries were too severe. He was pronounced dead after arriving at the hospital at 42 years old. The investigation into Watson's murder moved with serious urgency and full cooperation between American and Colombian authorities. Within weeks, Bogotá police had identified and arrested members of the crew responsible, and the U.S. Department of Justice made clear its intention to pursue extradition so the men involved could face trial in the United States rather than solely through the Colombian legal system. By July 2013, 6 Colombians connected to the crime had been indicted on charges related to Watson's kidnapping and murder. A 7th man, Wilson Daniel Peralta Bocachica, was identified separately, not as one of the original 6 robbery crew members, but as someone who had helped cover up the crime afterward. According to the government's case against him, Peralta Bocachica cleaned the taxicab where the attack happened, scrubbing away Watson's blood from the back seat and discarding the cleaning materials before eventually turning the vehicle in to the Colombian National Police, an attempt to destroy evidence before investigators could examine it properly. All 7 men were extradited from Colombia to the United States to face federal charges in the Eastern District of Virginia. What followed was a series of guilty pleas rather than a single courtroom trial, with each defendant eventually admitting their specific role in the conspiracy. Julio Esteban Gracia Ramirez, the driver who had picked up Watson in the first place, pleaded guilty in September 2014 to aiding and abetting the murder of an internationally protected person, along with conspiracy to kidnap an internationally protected person. He was sentenced that December to 27 years in prison. Hector Leonardo Lopez, who had driven the second taxi carrying the other conspirators, was sentenced the same day to 25 years. Andres Alvaro Oviedo Garcia, the man whose taxi had broken down before he could join the actual attack, was still held responsible as part of the broader conspiracy and was sentenced to 20 years. Edwin Gerardo Figueroa Sepulveda, the man who had used the stun gun on Watson, pleaded guilty to aiding and abetting murder, along with kidnapping conspiracy charges, and was sentenced in February 2015 to 30 years. The two men whose roles in the attack went deepest received the longest sentences of the group. Omar Fabian Valdez Gualtero, who had helped organize the entire crew and supplied the disposable phones used to coordinate the attack, pleaded guilty in December 2014 to second-degree murder and conspiracy to kidnap an internationally protected person, and was sentenced to 348 months in prison, roughly 29 years. Edgar Javier Bello Murillo, the man who actually stabbed Watson, pleaded guilty to the same charges and received the harshest sentence of anyone involved in the case, 440 months in prison, just under 37 years. Wilson Daniel Peralta Bocachica, who had cleaned the taxi and helped conceal evidence after the killing, rather than taking part in the attack itself, pleaded guilty to a single charge of obstruction of justice and received a far lighter sentence of 40 months, a little over 3 years. By the time the final 2 sentences were handed down in early 2015, all 7 men connected to Terry Watson's death had been identified, extradited, prosecuted, and sentenced, closing out a case that the Department of Justice described as having brought every single person responsible to justice. Attorney General Eric Holder spoke about Watson's service directly at multiple points during the prosecution, describing his career as both selfless and courageous, and stating that the Department of Justice would continue working to honor what Watson had sacrificed. DEA Administrator Michele Leonhardt echoed that sentiment, calling Watson a courageous and accomplished agent whose career and ultimate sacrifice the agency would remember permanently. Back home, the response to Watson's death reflected just how deeply his loss was felt by the community that had raised him. His memorial service was held at the Richland Arts Center in Rayville, Louisiana, close to Holly Ridge, where he had grown up. His family released a statement at the service describing how Watson had dedicated his life to serving the public and making the world safer, adding that he had never wasted a single minute of his life and never taken it for granted. A close friend and fellow DEA agent, Frank Tarantino, spoke at the service as well, telling the crowd that the world was a better place for having had Terry Watson in it, and that those left behind would carry on in his name. In 2016, a section of Louisiana Route 183 running through Richland Parish was officially renamed the James Terry Watson Memorial Highway, giving his hometown a permanent, physical reminder of the agent they had lost. Watson was survived by his wife, Fadia, his parents Paul and Henrietta, his stepmother Linda, his brother Scott, and other close family members who continue to keep his memory alive through organizations supporting fallen federal agents and their families. What makes Terry Watson's case different from most of the others on this list isn't the violence of what happened to him, which was every bit as brutal and senseless as anything described elsewhere here. It's the fact that the men who killed him were never connected to any specific cartel, never received orders from any drug trafficking organization, and by every piece of evidence gathered during the investigation, had absolutely no idea they had just killed a US federal agent until long after it was too late to matter. Watson survived combat against hundreds of Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan and rappelled down sheer cliffs to destroy heroin labs by hand, only to die on an ordinary city street in Bogota because a taxi driver decided a tired man walking out of a restaurant after watching a basketball game looked like an easy target. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Watson's death came from a robbery crew that had no idea who they were actually killing, the next chapter in this story flips that entirely on its head, centering on a vetted, trusted commander inside one of the DEA's own elite international units, a man the agency had specifically trained and certified to fight cartels from the inside, who turned out to have been secretly working for one of Mexico's most violent trafficking organizations the entire time. Ivan La Reina Reyes Arzate, the DEA-trained commander who sold secrets to the Beltran Leyva cartel. The man at the center of this case wasn't an American. He wasn't a DEA agent at all. Ivan Reyes Arzate was a Mexican federal police commander, trained personally by the DEA and trusted with some of the agency's most sensitive operations in Mexico. His story belongs on this list anyway, because it shows something just as damaging as a kidnapping or a killing. An entire DEA program built specifically to keep cartels out, secretly run from the inside by a man the cartels owned the whole time. Ivan Reyes Arzate served in the Mexican Federal Police from 2003 to 2016, working his way up through the ranks of one of the country's main law enforcement agencies. In 2008, he was promoted to a position that gave him extraordinary access and trust, commander of the Federal Police's Sensitive Investigative Unit, known inside both governments simply as the SIU. This wasn't an ordinary police assignment. The SIU had been specially created for one purpose: to work directly alongside the DEA inside Mexico, and every officer assigned to it, including Reyes Arzate himself, was sent to the United States to receive specialized training from the DEA at its facility in Quantico, Virginia. The DEA relied on the SIU for some of its most important work in the country, including coordinated surveillance, joint operations, and high-profile arrests of major traffickers. Reyes Arzate became the unit's principal point of contact for sharing information with American agents, the man DEA personnel in Mexico City turned to when they needed Mexican law enforcement to move on a target or share intelligence. His direct boss, as commander of the entire federal police, was Genaro Garcia Luna, who held the position of Mexico's Secretary of Public Security throughout most of this same period. On paper, Reyes Arzate looked like exactly the kind of trusted, vetted partner the DEA's entire Mexico strategy depended on. In practice, he was selling out that exact partnership for cash, and he had been doing it for years before anyone on the American side figured it out. During a meeting with Beltran Leyva organization leader Arturo Beltran Leyva around 2009, according to the federal criminal complaint later filed against him, Reyes Arzate revealed the identity of a DEA confidential informant, a man prosecutors described as having played an instrumental role in helping build an indictment against the cartel's leadership. This particular informant was a Colombian man who had originally been arrested in Miami and had agreed to cooperate with the DEA, providing detailed information about how the Beltran Leyva organization was moving cocaine shipments north from Colombia. According to testimony given years later by Sergio Villarreal Barragan, a high-ranking Beltran Leyva lieutenant known by the nickname El Grande because of his 6'8" frame, the organization had grown suspicious after a string of their cocaine shipments kept getting intercepted, and Beltran Leyva leadership held a meeting specifically to figure out how their operations kept being compromised. That meeting reportedly included Reyes Arzate, along with Luis Cardenas Palomino, another senior Mexican federal police official who would later become a co-defendant in a much larger corruption case. According to testimony from that hearing, officials at the meeting identified the DEA informant and physically handed his photograph over to Arturo Beltran Leyva himself. Beltran Leyva, furious at the betrayal, ordered a lieutenant named Mario Pineda Villa, who went by the nickname LMP, to kidnap the informant. Within days, the man was abducted, tortured, and murdered. Reyes Arzate and 2 other federal police officials involved in identifying him were paid $3 million total for handing over that single piece of information. This wasn't an isolated betrayal either. In 2010, According to testimony from El Grande at Reyes Arzate's later sentencing hearing, the Beltran Leyva organization paid $500,000 to Reyes Arzate and other corrupt Mexican police officers in exchange for help locating and arresting a rival trafficker named Edgar Valdez Villarreal, a Texas-born cartel figure who went by the nickname La Barbie and who was competing with the Beltran Leyva organization for control of valuable drug trafficking routes. Valdez Villarreal was eventually extradited to the United States and sentenced to nearly 50 years in prison, a case that, in a strange way, shows just how tangled Reyes Arzate's loyalties had become. He wasn't simply protecting one cartel from law enforcement. He was apparently willing to use his position to help one criminal organization eliminate a rival, all while officially serving as the DEA's most trusted Mexican law enforcement partner. For years, none of this surfaced. Reyes Arzate continued running the SIU, continued meeting regularly with American DEA agents stationed in Mexico City, and continued being treated as exactly the kind of reliable, professionally trained ally the entire binational drug enforcement relationship was supposed to be built on. According to later reporting, the moment everything fell apart came when a DEA agent who considered Reyes Arzate a close personal friend confronted him directly in a hotel room in Mexico City, having discovered evidence that Reyes Arzate had been feeding sensitive surveillance information to a cartel. Reyes Arzate broke down crying when confronted. DEA Special Agent Matthew Sandberg later testified that learning one of their most trusted Mexican colleagues had secretly been living a double life as a paid cartel informant felt like getting punched in the stomach, a comment that captures just how personally devastating this discovery was for the agents who had worked alongside Reyes Arzate for years, believing they had a genuine partner rather than a man quietly selling their operations to the people they were trying to catch. Rather than waiting to be arrested, Reyes Arzate flew voluntarily to Chicago with the DEA agent who had confronted him and turned himself in to American authorities. Federal prosecutors unsealed a 42-page criminal complaint against him, accusing him of leaking crucial information to cartel targets during an undercover investigation, including revealing the identity of a separate DEA informant who had to be evacuated from Mexico entirely for his own safety once the leak was discovered. According to the complaint, several other informants, including additional corrupt Mexican police officials, told American investigators that Reyes Arzate had been paid at least $3 million total for his betrayal over the years, the same figure connected to the murdered informant. In May 2018, Reyes Arzate pleaded guilty in federal court in Chicago to charges connected to selling confidential information to the Beltran Leyva cartel and interfering with joint Mexican and American narcotics investigations. Federal prosecutors had originally pushed for a 10-year sentence. Instead, in November 2018, the court sentenced him to just 3 years in prison, a dramatically lighter outcome that prosecutors justified by pointing to the fact that Reyes Arzate had voluntarily surrendered himself in Chicago rather than forcing authorities to track him down, and that he had since cooperated with the DEA. His own defense attorney had argued for an even lighter sentence, somewhere around 21 months, essentially time served, suggesting that what Reyes Arzate had done was simply business as usual in a country where corruption inside law enforcement was treated as an unfortunate norm rather than an extraordinary betrayal. The judge handling the case reportedly expressed surprise that prosecutors weren't pushing harder for a longer sentence, but accepted the government's position that Reyes Arzate wasn't being treated as an active collaborating witness in that particular proceeding. That wasn't the end of Reyes Arzate's legal troubles. A separate federal case in the same Chicago court system focused on a different stretch of his corruption, connected to a drug trafficking network known as El Seguimiento 39, an organization that moved cocaine and marijuana from Central America up through Mexico into Texas and California, working in cooperation with multiple major cartels at once, including the Sinaloa Cartel, the Beltran Leyva organization, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, and Los Zetas. According to this second case, in 2016, while still serving as SIU commander, Reyes Arzate learned that American investigators were actively tracking El Seguimiento 39's operations, and he accepted a bribe of $290,000 from people connected to that network in exchange for tipping them off. In October 2021, Reyes Arzate pleaded guilty to drug trafficking conspiracy charges tied to this second scheme. In February 2022, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for this conviction, though because he had already spent roughly 2 years in custody awaiting trial, he had only about 8 years left to serve at the time of sentencing. Speaking to the judge during that hearing, Reyes Arzate described himself as a man who did not run away from his responsibilities, language that stands in fairly stark contrast to a career built almost entirely on secretly running away from the responsibilities he had sworn to uphold as a federal police commander trusted by both his own government and the DEA. Federal prosecutors and DEA officials were direct about how they viewed what Reyes Arzate had done. United States Attorney Breon Peace said that Reyes Arzate had forged what he called a deplorable alliance with drug traffickers, betraying not just the Mexican people he had been sworn to protect, but also the law enforcement partners who had put themselves at genuine risk working alongside him to disrupt the very network he was secretly protecting. Ray Donovan, the DEA special agent in charge of the criminal investigation into Reyes Arzate, said that as a federal police commander, Reyes Arzate had essentially offered traffickers a perfect operating environment, turning a blind eye toward their activities while wearing the badge of someone meant to be hunting them down, and described the years-long effort by DEA and its law enforcement partners to finally identify and bring what he called this bad seed to justice. The story didn't stay contained to Reyes Arzate alone, because he had served as SIU commander directly under Genaro Garcia Luna's authority. As Mexico's top security official, federal prosecutors building a separate, much larger corruption case against Garcia Luna himself eventually drew a direct line between the two men's conduct. Garcia Luna, who had served as Mexico's Secretary of Public Security from 2006 to 2012, was arrested in the United States in December 2019 and later stood trial in federal court in Brooklyn, accused of accepting massive bribes from the Sinaloa Cartel in exchange for protecting its operations and undermining efforts against it, including, according to prosecutors, some of the same kind of betrayal that had defined Reyes Arzate's career inside the SIU. Reyes Arzate, along with other former narcos and corrupt officials including El Grande himself, was expected to testify or provide evidence in proceedings connected to Garcia Luna's case, helping prosecutors establish just how deeply compromised Mexico's own federal security apparatus had become at the very moment the DEA believed it had found its most reliable Mexican law enforcement partner in the fight against the country's most violent cartels. What makes Reyes Arzate's case land differently than most others on this list is exactly that sense of institutional betrayal rather than personal violence. Nobody put a gun to his head. Nobody tortured him into compliance. The DEA had handpicked him, flown him to Virginia for specialized training, and built years of operations around trusting his unit completely. And the entire time, he was quietly auctioning off the identities of the agency's own informants to the highest bidder, men who would go on to torture and kill the very people who had risked everything by agreeing to help American investigators in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Reyes Arzate's betrayal played out across years of secret meetings and million-dollar payoffs, eventually unraveling through a confession in a Mexico City hotel room, the next entry on this list involves something far murkier and far less resolved. Two DEA sources embedded deep inside one of Mexico's most dangerous trafficking networks, who simply disappeared right as the biggest indictment of the agency's career was about to become public, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions in a handful of congressional letters that nobody in Washington has ever fully explained. The two DEA informants Senator Grassley says were killed inside Los Chapitos, a case still without answers. Unlike every other case on this list, the deaths described here have never been officially confirmed by the Drug Enforcement Administration or the Department of Justice. No names have been released. No dates, locations, or causes of death have been made public. What exists is a U.S. senator's allegation, built on information his office says it received from credible sources, sent in a formal letter to one of the highest-ranking officials at the Justice Department. That's a serious thing on its own, coming from a sitting member of the Senate Judiciary Committee with real oversight authority over federal law enforcement. But it is not the same as a confirmed fact, and presenting it as anything more than an allegation under investigation would be dishonest. This case is included specifically because it shows how little the public sometimes gets to know about the people risking their lives deep inside cartel networks on the DEA's behalf, even when the stakes involve actual deaths that may never be fully explained. To understand the story, you first need to understand who Los Chapitos are. The name refers to four sons connected to Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the infamous Sinaloa cartel leader, convicted in a U.S. court in 2019. Two of them, Ovidio Guzman Lopez and Joaquin Guzman Lopez, along with their half-brothers Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar and Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar, inherited large portions of their father's drug trafficking empire and built it into one of the most aggressive fentanyl distribution networks moving product into the United States. American law enforcement had already brought drug trafficking charges against several of the brothers back in 2018 and 2019, but none of those earlier charges involved fentanyl specifically, the synthetic opioid that has driven an unprecedented wave of overdose deaths across the United States in recent years. Multiple federal agencies were working their own angles on Los Chapitos at the same time, and according to Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, that overlapping effort is exactly where things started going wrong. Homeland Security investigations, working alongside the FBI, had built its own case against the Chapitos brothers, an effort that included an operation known as Operation Paisano. On January 5, 2023, HSI successfully coordinated with Mexican authorities to arrest Ovidio Guzman Lopez in the town of Jesus Maria, in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. That arrest connected directly to a joint superseding indictment that federal prosecutors had actually obtained back on December 14, 2022, charging all four Chapitos brothers with 36 separate violations under a federal law called the Continuing Criminal Enterprise Statute, a charge that carries a potential sentence of life in prison. Evidence gathered through HSI's Operation Paisano accounted for 11 of those 36 charged violations. Notably, the DEA wasn't listed anywhere on that particular indictment as having taken part in building the case. Here's where the timeline gets complicated and, according to Grassley, deeply troubling. That December 2022 indictment wasn't actually unsealed and made public right away. It sat for 4 months before finally becoming public on April 14, 2023, in the Southern District of New York, charging 3 of the 4 brothers with fentanyl trafficking. On that exact same day, DEA Administrator Ann Milgram held a separate public announcement stating that her agency had successfully infiltrated the Sinaloa cartel and the Chapitos organization at the highest levels, claiming credit for major access inside the network. According to Grassley's letter, the DEA had developed its own competing investigation into the same targets, and rather than letting the HSI and FBI case move forward on its own established timeline, the Justice Department reportedly paused arrest efforts across other agencies, specifically to give the DEA's separate, unilateral investigation more time to develop. Grassley framed this as the Justice Department effectively choosing to defer to the DEA's slower-moving case over investigations from other agencies that were, according to him, already prepared to move forward months earlier. The most serious claim in Grassley's letter, dated August 21, 2023, and sent directly to Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, is this. According to information his office had received, 2 cooperating sources that the DEA had placed inside the Los Chapitos network had been murdered in Mexico, and this happened during the exact period when the Justice Department was reportedly giving the DEA additional time to keep developing its own investigation rather than moving forward with charges that other agencies already had ready. Grassley's letter put it directly, stating that despite these deaths, the Deputy Attorney General's office reportedly continued giving the DEA more time to pursue its unilateral approach. He demanded answers about exactly what had happened, what role the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York may have played in decisions connected to the cooperators' deaths, and why the Justice Department continued backing the DEA's approach, even after, according to his information, 2 people working as DEA assets had already been killed. When journalists with the Mexican outlet Grupo Reforma reached out to Senator Grassley's office for more specifics, his staff said they could not share details about the underlying sources that had provided information about the deaths of the 2 informants, while still maintaining that the senator was determined to hold the Justice Department accountable for what had happened. As of that reporting, the Justice Department had not responded publicly to Reforma's request for comment on the allegations. This is an important detail and worth sitting with for a moment. A sitting U.S. Senator made a specific, written claim to the Deputy Attorney General about 2 deaths connected to a federal law enforcement operation, and the Department of Justice, as far as public reporting shows, never issued a clear public confirmation or denial of that specific claim. Some additional reporting helps fill in a little more context about what the DEA's informant network inside Los Chapitos actually looked like, even without confirming the identities of anyone who may have died. According to Mexican journalist Penili Ramirez, writing for Reforma, the DEA maintained at least 3 separate sources embedded deep inside the close inner circle of Los Chapitos, sources who, between 2017 and 2022, reportedly delivered recordings, photographs of locations and vehicles, and information about the identities of associates and the locations of drug labs. These sources had reportedly recorded conversations involving Ovidio Guzman himself for roughly 3 years leading up to his eventual arrest. One especially detailed account from this reporting describes a meeting in May 2022 at a remote ranch in Sinaloa, where Ovidio Guzman, known by the nickname El Raton, met with high-level cartel figures, surrounded by more than 40 armed men and 6 armored trucks equipped with mounted machine guns. According to this account, DEA informants were present among the security personnel at that meeting. Ovidio reportedly told the group he was working to centralize fentanyl manufacturing within Sinaloa and expressed specific concern about being tracked by DEA surveillance, all while, according to the same reporting, at least one person in that heavily armed room may have been secretly reporting back to the very agency he feared. At that same meeting, Ovidio reportedly closed a drug distribution deal with a buyer based in Los Angeles. The reporting also notes that the DEA's 3 confirmed sources inside the network were still active as of at least May 2021, a detail that, when laid next to Grassley's later claim that 2 cooperators had been killed sometime before August 2023, leaves a real, unresolved gap in the public timeline about exactly when and how those alleged deaths actually happened. It's worth noting that concerns about how poorly the DEA and other federal agencies have historically tracked and protected their confidential informants didn't start with this specific case. A separate Treasury Department Inspector General report, cited in reporting connected to this story, found that federal agencies, including the DEA, have at times relied on individual confidential informants for staggering lengths of time and staggering amounts of money, including one source. The DEA reportedly paid roughly $30 million across 30 years of service, an average of about $1 million annually for a single person's information. Other reporting connected to this broader pattern points back to much older, deeply troubling cases, including a notorious situation in the early 2000s, sometimes referred to as the House of Death, involving a different federal informant working for a different agency who was allowed to continue committing serious crimes, including participating in murders in Mexico, while still collecting payment and protection from the US government. None of that older case is the same as what allegedly happened to the 2 Chapitos network cooperators Grassley described, but it shows a documented, long-running pattern of American agencies sometimes losing control over exactly what their paid sources are doing and exactly how much danger those sources are actually in. What the DEA has stated publicly about its overall work against Los Chapitos, separate from any specific informant deaths, paints a picture of an agency claiming real, substantial success. In testimony to federal officials connected to the Department of Justice in 2024, DEA leadership stated that the agency's broader strategy against the Chapitos network of the Sinaloa cartel had resulted in charges against 28 members and associates connected to the organization, spanning everyone from chemical suppliers based in China to a broker in Guatemala helping move materials into Mexico, lab operators converting raw chemicals into finished fentanyl pills and powder, weapons traffickers, and money launderers moving drug proceeds back across the border. The agency reported seizing more than 79 million fake fentanyl pills and nearly 12,000 pounds of fentanyl powder in 2023 alone, numbers the DEA itself translated into more than 380 million potentially deadly doses kept off American streets. These are real, documented enforcement numbers tied to actual public statements from DEA leadership. They simply don't address, one way or another, the specific allegation Grassley raised about 2 cooperators allegedly losing their lives somewhere along the way. This case sits in an uncomfortable, unresolved place, and it deserves to be presented that way rather than dressed up with invented details just to make it feel more complete. A United States Senator with direct oversight authority over the Justice Department formally alleged that 2 people working secretly for the DEA inside one of the most violent fentanyl trafficking networks on Earth were killed, and that federal officials kept supporting the DEA's approach even after learning about those deaths. The Justice Department has never publicly confirmed or denied this specific claim in a way that fully resolves the question. The identities of the 2 people Grassley referenced, if his information is accurate, have never been made public. Whether they have surviving families who know exactly what happened to them, or families left wondering for years why someone they loved disappeared, remains something the public record simply doesn't answer. Sometimes the most honest way to tell a story like this is to admit clearly where the documented facts stop and where the unanswered questions begin. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the fate of those two informants remains genuinely unresolved, the next case on this list moves from an open question straight into a fully adjudicated American federal courtroom, where the very Mexican official who supervised the DEA's most trusted partnership inside Mexico's own federal police was put on trial in Brooklyn, accused of taking cartel money at a scale that made everything covered earlier in this list look almost small by comparison. Genaro Garcia Luna, the DEA's most trusted partner in Mexico, was secretly the cartel's man. Genaro Garcia Luna was never a DEA agent. He never even worked for the United States government. He was a Mexican government official, eventually the country's top law enforcement officer, and for years he stood as the DEA's single most important partner inside Mexico. That's exactly what makes his story worth telling here. While agents like Kiki Camarena were getting kidnapped and killed by cartels in the field, the man controlling the entire Mexican federal police, the man the DEA gave awards to for his work fighting crime, was secretly taking the cartel's money the whole time. Genaro Garcia Luna was born on July 10, 1968, in Mexico City. He studied mechanical engineering at the Autonomous Metropolitan University and later completed a diploma in strategic planning at Mexico's National University, UNAM. His career in Mexican law enforcement and intelligence began well before he ever became a household name. In 2000, he was named Director for Planning and Operation at the Federal Judicial Police, where he introduced new administrative structures and operational ideas. In 2001, he became the founding Director General of Mexico's Federal Investigation Agency, known by its Spanish initials, AFI, a position he held until 2005. His time leading the AFI wasn't without controversy even then. In 2005, a kidnapping rescue operation broadcast live on Mexican television, presented to the public as an unfolding real-time rescue of kidnapping victims, turned out to have been staged. The supposed kidnappers, including a French national named Florence Cassez, had actually been detained the day before and held without proper legal process for nearly 20 hours before the cameras rolled, and one detainee later claimed he had been tortured during that time. Garcia Luna was also the official who announced the arrests of two separate serial killers, Raúl Ociel Marroquín and Juana Barraza, within the same week in January 2006, giving him a high public profile heading into his next, much bigger role. From 2006 to 2012, Garcia Luna served as Mexico's Secretary of Public Security under President Felipe Calderón, making him the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the entire country. In that role, he had direct control over Mexico's federal police force, the same organization that included the Sensitive Investigative Unit, specially trained by the DEA, to work hand-in-hand with American agents inside Mexico. Garcia Luna became, by every outward appearance, exactly the kind of high-level ally the United States needed in its fight against Mexican drug cartels. The DEA gave him multiple awards over the years, specifically honoring his work fighting crime. At the very same time he was collecting those honors, according to evidence later presented at his federal trial in the United States, Garcia Luna was secretly working for the Sinaloa Cartel, one of the most powerful and violent trafficking organizations in the world. According to the evidence federal prosecutors eventually built against him, Garcia Luna used his official government positions to protect and assist the Sinaloa Cartel in exchange for millions of dollars in bribes. This wasn't a passive form of corruption where he simply looked the other way. Prosecutors described active, hands-on assistance. Garcia Luna's conduct, according to the case against him, included facilitating safe passage for the cartel's drug shipments, handing over sensitive law enforcement information about ongoing investigations into the cartel's own operations, and even helping the cartel launch attacks against its rival trafficking organizations, all of which helped the importation of multi-ton quantities of cocaine and other drugs into the United States. In exchange for their cut of the bribe money, members of Garcia Luna's own federal police force reportedly acted as bodyguards and personal escorts for cartel members, in some cases allowing actual Sinaloa cartel operatives to wear official police uniforms and badges as cover. Federal police personnel under Garcia Luna's command also reportedly helped physically unload cocaine shipments arriving by plane at Mexico City's airport, then delivered that cocaine directly to the cartel. The way Garcia Luna was paid, according to testimony at his trial, paints a vivid picture of just how deeply this corruption ran. He was paid in American currency, $100 bills bundled into stacks of $10,000 each, stuffed into suitcases, briefcases, and duffel bags depending on the situation. The amount of money he received reportedly grew over the years as the Sinaloa cartel itself grew larger and more powerful, partly because of the exact protection Garcia Luna was providing. Former cartel members who later testified against him described handing off bribe money to Garcia Luna at a variety of locations across Mexico, including a so-called safe house in Mexico City, where large amounts of cash were physically hidden behind a false wall, a car wash in Guadalajara, and even a French restaurant in Mexico City, sitting directly across the street from the United States Embassy. During the 2018 federal trial of Sinaloa cartel leader Joaquin El Chapo Guzman in the United States, Guzman's own partner, Jesus Zambada Garcia, testified that he personally had bribed Garcia Luna with suitcases stuffed full of $3 million in cash on 2 separate occasions, testimony that helped establish a public paper trail leading directly toward Garcia Luna years before his own arrest. Garcia Luna left his position as Secretary of Public Security in 2012 and moved to the United States not long after, settling into a life far removed, at least on paper, from his old role overseeing Mexican law enforcement. In 2018, he took a significant step toward making that new life permanent, submitting an application for United States naturalization. On that application, prosecutors later proved Garcia Luna lied directly about his own past criminal conduct on behalf of the Sinaloa cartel, attempting to become an American citizen while actively concealing the exact corruption that was about to catch up with him. It did catch up with him. On December 9, 2019, Garcia Luna was arrested in the United States on charges connected to taking bribes from the Sinaloa cartel. He pleaded not guilty to the charges against him on October 7, 2020. His case moved slowly through the federal court system over the following years, eventually reaching trial in February 2023 in front of United States District Judge Brian M. Cogan in Brooklyn, New York. The trial lasted 4 weeks, and the government built its case around testimony from former high-ranking members of the Sinaloa cartel who had direct, personal knowledge of Garcia Luna's corrupt activities, men who had once worked alongside him in the very arrangement prosecutors were now laying out for a jury. On February 21, 2023, that jury found Garcia Luna guilty on all 5 counts contained in his superseding indictment. The charges included engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise covering 6 separate drug-related violations: conspiracy to distribute cocaine internationally, conspiracy to distribute and possess cocaine with intent to distribute, conspiracy to import cocaine, and making false statements, the last charge tied directly to the lies he had told on his citizenship application. The conviction made Garcia Luna, once the single highest-ranking law enforcement official in all of Mexico, a convicted felon in the United States, facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in prison and a maximum sentence of life. Between his conviction and his eventual sentencing, Garcia Luna made one more serious mistake, one that revealed just how far he was still willing to go to escape accountability. While awaiting sentencing, the court found that Garcia Luna had attempted to obstruct justice by trying to bribe fellow inmates to provide false testimony, an effort specifically aimed at overturning the jury's guilty verdict against him. The court took this additional misconduct into account during the sentencing process that followed. On October 16, 2024, almost 20 months after his conviction, Judge Kogan sentenced Garcia Luna to 460 months in federal prison, just over 38 years, along with a $2 million fine for what the court described as a decade-long pattern of assistance to the Sinaloa cartel in exchange for millions of dollars in bribes. DEA Administrator Ann Milgram spoke directly to the significance of the case at sentencing, stating that the outcome sent a clear message to corrupt leaders anywhere in the world who use positions of power to help cartels, that no amount of power would shield them from justice. She pointed out plainly that Garcia Luna had accepted millions of dollars in bribes from the Sinaloa cartel, specifically to allow millions of kilograms of cocaine to flood into the United States, and that instead of protecting the people of Mexico, Garcia Luna had spent years protecting the cartels responsible for harming them. Homeland Security Investigations Executive Associate Director Katrina Berger echoed that sentiment, calling the sentencing a powerful message that no one stands above the law. The investigation that brought Garcia Luna down had been led by HSI's El Dorado Task Force, the first money laundering task force of its kind in the country, working alongside the New York Strike Force, a multi-agency unit supported by both the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force program and the New York and New Jersey High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area program. Garcia Luna is currently serving his sentence at ADX Florence, the federal government's highest security prison, located in Colorado and reserved for some of the most dangerous and high-profile inmates in the entire federal system. His projected release date sits decades away, on July 19, 2052, when he will be in his 80s. Separate from his American prosecution, Mexico's own Attorney General's office had reportedly been looking into extraditing Garcia Luna back to Mexico to face additional, related charges there, a process that remains separate from and unaffected by the sentence he is currently serving in the United States. The fallout from his conviction also reopened old, unresolved political questions back in Mexico. Roberta Jacobson, who served as the United States ambassador to Mexico from 2016 to 2018, stated in 2020 that she believed the government of former President Felipe Calderón had known about Garcia Luna's ties to the Sinaloa cartel while he was actively serving as the country's top security official. Calderón himself has firmly denied this, insisting his administration had no knowledge of Garcia Luna's double life at the time. What makes Garcia Luna's case land so heavily, even compared to other corruption cases on this list, is the sheer scale of the trust he was given and the scale of the betrayal underneath it. This wasn't a single agent quietly skimming money from sting operations, or a regional police commander selling out one specific informant. This was the man who controlled the entire federal police force of Mexico, the same agency the DEA depended on for joint operations across the whole country, secretly functioning as one of the Sinaloa cartel's most valuable protectors for the better part of a decade, all while collecting American law enforcement awards for the exact opposite reputation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Garcia Luna spent years accepting suitcases of cartel cash in secret meetings across Mexico City, the final case on this list goes back to basics. A DEA agent who spent 8 years working undercover and was killed on his very last day on the job, shot 5 times in an Arizona garage by the same meth trafficker he had spent months setting up for arrest. Richard Fass, the DEA agent, killed on his last day, undercover. Richard E. Fass was 37 years old and a week away from moving his family to Mexico when he was killed. He had spent 8 years working undercover for the Drug Enforcement Administration, the kind of sustained, face-to-face work where a single slip of character, a wrong word, or a moment of hesitation could end your life before backup ever arrived. By the summer of 1994, Fass had done that job long enough that the DEA was pulling him off the streets and moving him into an administrative position at the agency's office in Monterrey, Mexico. His wife and their 4 children were already packed and ready, waiting for him to finish up so the family could make the move together. He had one final undercover assignment left to complete, just one, and then he was done. Fass worked out of the DEA's Phoenix Field Division in Arizona, and in the months leading up to his death, he had been building a case against a Mexican drug trafficking organization run by a man named Agustin Vasquez Mendoza. Vasquez Mendoza led a criminal organization that operated several clandestine methamphetamine laboratories in the Mexican state of Sonora, producing significant quantities of meth specifically for import into the United States. The organization didn't just manufacture drugs. According to authorities who later prosecuted the case, it also specialized in robbing drug dealers, meaning its members were experienced in violent, predatory criminal behavior against people who couldn't call the police when things went wrong. Fass had penetrated that organization through undercover work, operating under a cover identity and building toward a buy that would generate the kind of evidence needed for a federal prosecution. On June 30th, 1994, Fass and his DEA partner, Special Agent Michael Pelonero, drove to an automotive repair shop in Glendale, Arizona, a suburb of Phoenix, to make a final undercover drug purchase. They were carrying $160,000 in cash, the agreed-upon price for 22 pounds of methamphetamine that Fass had arranged the day before with Vasquez Mendoza and an associate named Augustin Cuevas Cordova. What made the timing of this particular assignment so striking was that it wasn't just any ordinary workday for Fass. That morning, his colleagues at the Phoenix Field Division had thrown him a farewell luncheon, a celebration specifically because he was leaving undercover work behind for good, transitioning to an administrative desk job in Monterrey. The luncheon ended around 2 in the afternoon. By 2:30 or so, Fass and Pelonero were driving to the garage for the buy. His colleagues were still cleaning up from the party. Pelonero showed the cash to Vasquez Mendoza's associate, Augustin Vasquez, confirming the money was real and the deal was ready to go. At 6:30 in the evening, Vasquez made a call to whoever was coordinating the handoff, signaling that the money was there and the transaction was good to proceed. 2 minutes later, at 6:32, Pelonero radioed all units to let them know the deal was moving forward. 3 minutes after that, everything fell apart. Instead of handing over drugs, Vasquez and a second man named Rafael Rubio Mendez forced Fass and the 2 confidential informants who were present into a back room of the garage at gunpoint. There were no drugs. According to prosecutors who later tried the case, there had never been any drugs. The entire setup had been a robbery from the start. Vasquez Mendoza, according to the government's account, had orchestrated a plan to steal the $160,000 in buy money from the DEA and to kill anyone who resisted. As the men tried to handcuff Fass, he made a decision in that back room that showed exactly the instinct that had kept him alive through 8 years of undercover work. He drew his weapon and shot at Rubio Mendez. Vasquez responded by shooting Fass multiple times at close range. Both Vasquez and Rubio Mendez then fled the scene on foot, leaving Fass bleeding on the garage floor. Pelonero, still outside with the other units, heard the gunfire and immediately called for backup. He then went into the garage, and found Fass on the floor with multiple gunshot wounds. The Washington Times later reported that Fass had been shot 3 times in the head and once in the chest. The Washington Examiner's account described him being shot 5 times. What all sources agree on is that the wounds were severe and unsurvivable. Fass died within an hour of the shooting. His wife and 4 children, who had been waiting for him to finish this last assignment so they could leave together for Mexico, were instead told that Richard wasn't coming home at all. Within minutes of the shooting, federal agents were in pursuit of the men who had fled. At 6:45 in the evening, Vasquez was arrested near the crime scene. 7 minutes later, at 6:52, Rubio Mendez was also taken into custody. A grand jury handed down an indictment on July 5, 1994, just 5 days after the shooting, charging Vasquez Mendoza with murder, conspiracy, armed robbery, attempted murder, attempted armed robbery, kidnapping, and burglary. But there was a problem. Vasquez Mendoza himself, the man who had allegedly orchestrated the entire robbery and the plan to kill anyone who resisted, was nowhere to be found. He had vanished and fled across the border into Mexico before law enforcement could reach him, leaving the 2 men he had used to carry out the plan behind to face the legal consequences on their own. The Phoenix DEA Field Division launched an immediate manhunt, working alongside the FBI and the Glendale Police Department's Homicide Unit. Rafael Rubio Mendez and Juan Vasquez Rubio, the 2 men arrested at the scene, were both prosecuted in Arizona. They were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison for the killing of Richard Fass. But Agustin Vasquez Mendoza, the man prosecutors described as the mastermind who arranged the robbery and instructed his people to kill if anyone resisted, was living freely somewhere in Mexico, beyond the reach of American courts. As months turned into years without a capture, the case drew national attention. In 1996, Fass's case was featured on the television program Unsolved Mysteries, which helped keep public awareness of the manhunt alive at a time when Vasquez Mendoza had already been on the run for 2 years. The FBI eventually added Vasquez Mendoza to its official 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list, making him the 445th person ever added to that roster. The DEA and FBI initially offered a combined reward of $250,000 for information leading to his capture. That figure was later dramatically increased to $2.2 million through a State Department counter-narcotics rewards program that Congress had established in 1986 specifically to help capture major drug traffickers. It was, at the time, one of the largest rewards ever offered in connection with the killing of a federal agent. The manhunt extended across most of the late 1990s. Investigators believed Vasquez Mendoza had received help from at least one family member with the surname Prado Vasquez, from the town of Aguililla in the Mexican state of Michoacán, in staying hidden and moving around. DEA agents believed the fugitive had been sheltered within a network of contacts connected to his drug trafficking background, making it extremely difficult to pin down his location through normal channels. But on July 9, 2000, 6 years after he had fled the garage in Glendale, Mexican authorities arrested Agustin Vasquez Mendoza in the state of Puebla, Mexico. He was taken into custody without resistance. What followed his arrest was its own drawn-out legal fight, one that dragged on for another 4.5 years before Vasquez Mendoza ever set foot inside an American courtroom. The Mexican Supreme Court ruled that under Mexico's constitution at the time, the country was forbidden from extraditing suspects who faced the possibility of a life sentence without parole in the United States, on the grounds that such a sentence would eliminate any possibility of rehabilitation. This legal barrier meant that even though Vasquez Mendoza was sitting in Mexican custody, the United States couldn't immediately bring him across the border to face trial. To resolve the impasse, US officials agreed to formally waive both the death penalty and the possibility of a sentence of life without parole as conditions of extradition, with prosecutors instead recommending a sentence of life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. That concession was significant, particularly for the family of Richard Fass, who had watched the man responsible for planning their father's death remain free for 6 years and then sit in Mexican custody for another 4.5 years, while lawyers argued over the terms of his return. Mexican authorities tried Vasquez Mendoza on a domestic drug trafficking charge first, concluding that case in late January 2005. Once that proceeding ended, and he had been sentenced to time served on the Mexican charge, the legal avenue for extradition was clear. DEA agents physically removed Vasquez Mendoza from Mexico City and transported him to Glendale, Arizona, where he arrived on a Saturday in late January 2005, more than a decade after the night he had arranged to steal $160,000 from an undercover DEA agent and kill anyone who got in the way. DEA Special Agent in Charge Landrum said at the time that Vasquez Mendoza's extradition served notice that the worldwide efforts of the DEA would be brought to bear on anyone who harms or kills an American agent, no matter how long it takes. U.S. Attorney Paul K. Charlton called the day a good day for law enforcement. Maricopa County Attorney Andrew Thomas described it as the culmination of a long and arduous investigation. Vasquez Mendoza was prosecuted in Maricopa County, Arizona, on the original 1994 indictment. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 70 years in prison. Combined with the life sentences already being served by the 2 men who had actually carried out the shooting inside the garage, the full criminal accountability for Richard Fass's death took just over a decade to complete from beginning to end. Across 2 countries, multiple court systems, 1 FBI Most Wanted designation, and a $2.2 million international reward, Richard Fass was remembered by his colleagues inside the DEA as one of the agency's most effective undercover agents. A man who had spent 7 years doing some of the most psychologically demanding work in federal law enforcement before he was promoted out of it and killed on the very day his time in those streets was supposed to be over. He left behind a wife and 4 children who had been waiting with their bags already packed for a family move that never happened. The specific cruelty of the timing, the farewell lunch in the afternoon, and the ambush in the garage 3 hours later is the kind of detail that stays with people long after the legal proceedings are finished and the names of the men convicted have faded from memory. What stays is that Richard Fass had already made it out. He had done the hard years, survived the undercover work, earned the desk job, and was a single afternoon away from a completely different chapter of his life with his family. The men who killed him didn't know any of that, and it wouldn't have changed anything if they had. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.